Now, why does it matter what the UN did in Rwanda all those years ago? Well, because even today, a genocide is taking place right in front of our eyes in Palestine, and the same people have now started bombing Lebanon and other areas. So, just like back then, people today are looking towards the UN and looking towards the West, hoping for somebody to step in and do something before it's too late. But learning about what happened back then will help us understand what exactly is going to happen in the future, because patterns and people, they repeat themselves, but we keep forgetting. Last week we talked about the Bosnian genocide and the role that the UN had during all of that. If you want to watch that video, you can head on over down to the description box. There's a link there, and I'll also link it at the end of this video. But today, we're going to talk about the Rwandan genocide. Now, this video is in no way a detailed video about the Rwandan genocide itself. I'm just going to give you guys an overview of what was happening, and then we're going to talk about what the UN did in detail. In 1994, extremists from the majority population in Rwanda, who were known as Hutus, decided to carry out a genocide against the minorities, the Tutsis. This genocide only lasted 100 days, but it's estimated that more than 1 million people were killed during such a short time period. And what's even sadder is the fact that during this whole time, armed forces of the UN were present there on ground, and they could have helped. But what they did was pretty much the opposite. Now, before we break it down, what exactly is the UN, right? So the United Nations, which we call the UN as a short form, today they have a lot of different branches, they have a lot of different committees, and they're doing a lot throughout the world. But when it was conceived in 1945, after the Second World War, their only aim was to be peacekeepers throughout the world, to prevent any such wars in the future. Their own website says the United Nations, which it hoped would prevent another world war like the one they had just lived through. Now, reading these statements again, maybe they meant that they just want to avoid wars on European or American soils. And no, I'm not just saying this, because right after the Second World War, the entire world was plunged into an era of proxy wars, blatant wars like the Vietnam War, and weird coups and actual good leaders being taken off the throne and dictators being placed instead of them, who were all controlled by the US. And even though during that time period these looked like isolated incidents, but all of this was a part of the Cold War, which was kind of going on between the United States and the USSR. And even during that, the UN was used in such weird, shifty ways because they were actually used to legitimize some of these wars. And maybe I'll make more videos about the Cold War and all of that in the future. But for now, let's head on back to the 1990s and have a look at what the UN did during the Rwandan genocide. Now, after the Rwandan civil war, the UN deployed some of its armed forces into Rwanda to kind of stop it from slipping back into war. These armed forces were called the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda. As a short form, it's called UNAMIR. I'm going to be calling it UNAMIR from here onwards. The UNAMIR's rules of engagement allowed the peacekeepers to intervene and use deadly force to prevent crimes against humanity. All of this was nice talk, but when the president Habyarimana's sudden death resulted in a Hutu power grab, you could see that the UN was forgetting its own rules of engagement. The commander of the UNAMIR, Romeo Dallaire, actually reported that he got a call from the UN and was given a command that UNAMIR was not to fire unless fired upon. They were to negotiate and above all else, avoid conflict. Now, we saw a similar situation in the case of Bosnia, where the UN was reluctant to kind of jump into the conflict to kind of help out. And the same thing was repeated in Rwanda a couple of years later. And in the case of Rwanda, the UN headquarters basically had very little idea of what was going on, like what was the ground reality. So even when Romeo Dallaire would constantly put in requests to get authorization to fire and jump into the conflict, all his requests were immediately denied because, they quote, because the UN could not understand how 5,000 troops could have saved 500,000 lives. So they kept up this policy of non-confrontation, and that turned out to be a death wish for hundreds of thousands of Rwandans. Now, if you look at the UNAMIR itself, these forces were like a ragtag team. They weren't even like a proper battalion. There were only 2,500 peacekeepers in this force, and all of them were very badly equipped. They could barely register as a capable military unit. In early 1994, when a string of political deaths and assassinations kind of started to take place in Rwanda, Dallaire constantly put in requests in the UN to be able to do something. Initially, as I mentioned, they kept denying him, but eventually, when they did give him permission to do something, they told him that he has to take the police on board and only then he can carry out weapons searches. Now, because of this policy, the mission kind of failed and very few weapons were actually found. Now, early on in this video, we talked about the death of the Rwandan president, which kind of triggered everything. Now, a day after the president died, a group of people stormed the Prime Minister's compound, and this compound was actually under the protection of the Belgian and Ghanaian peacekeepers from the United Nations. But the Hutus were not only able to enter the compound, they assassinated the Prime Minister and then went on to killing 10 Belgian peacekeepers whose bodies they also mutilated. And while all of this was happening, the peacekeepers just stood there. They didn't fire a single shot because of the orders that the UN headquarters had given them of not engaging. But the Hutus were actually very smart. They knew that killing and mutilating the white men of the UN peacekeeping forces would have the effects that they wanted. And soon enough, a cry erupted from the UN itself to either expanding UNAMIR's mandate or immediately pulling out of Rwanda. Now, by this point, it had become clear to the international community that UNAMIR was clearly inept to kind of do anything about the situation in Rwanda. And at the same time, if they wanted to make this force much more efficient, the UN members would have needed to put in money and people into the forces. But at that point, nobody wanted their own people to die, and they decided to pull out of the UN, which is exactly what the Hutus wanted. And it said that while these Belgian forces were on their way to the airport, they refused to protect any Rwandans who were being killed and shot, and they just wanted to flee. And all of this was a very ironic, accurate picture of the UN's role in Rwanda, because they didn't really help out at all. After the majority of the forces of the United Nations withdrew from Rwanda, only about 270 people were left, and they were again given orders not to engage. Eventually, a French-led mission was kind of approved by the Security Council, which was called Mission Turquoise, and that mission did help save a lot of lives in southwest Rwanda. But people also claim that the area that came under the French, a lot of people who were with the aggressors and who were causing the problems, they were allowed to escape, which included soldiers, military men, and other people who were very active during the genocide. It was eventually the Rwandan Patriotic Front which kind of captured Kigali and overthrew the Hutu government, and that's when the genocide came to a stop. Now, looking at all of this, the question then arises that why was the United Nations not able to do anything? And like we talked about in our previous video, the core of the issue lies with how this organization was made. The UN itself doesn't have any power. It relies on these other sovereign states and it takes its power from them. But when the member states don't want it to do anything, the UN cannot do anything, especially the more influential member states. And in the case of Bosnia and Rwanda both, a general consensus among researchers is that it was the US which at this point decided that it does not want to intervene. Their own justification was that, well, we've been the peacekeeping force in the world for majority of the last century and we're tired of it. But in actuality, they were never a peacekeeping force. They were just doing things in their own interest and actually causing a lot more havoc than needed in the world. But maybe more on that some other time. The US now wanted the Europeans to kind of step in and do something about all of this. And the Europeans, they didn't care. They wanted the US to do something. So, in this kind of situation, these people were pretty much left helpless. In the case of Bosnia, we know that the NATO eventually stepped in and did kind of turn the tide of the war. The UN's effort in both Bosnia and Rwanda were a failure, and in 1999, the UN itself actually released a report where they talked about their own shortcomings during the Rwandan and the Bosnian genocide. They used the capture of Srebrenica and everything that happened there as a snapshot of the issues. And the report admitted to a philosophy of neutrality and non-violence wholly being unsuited to the conflict in Bosnia, and criticized those who negotiated with Milosevic and Mladic rather than using military force in the war's early stages. The UN therefore made clear the inadequacy of its entire approach and the inadequacy of a system that allowed political considerations to color the UN's military decisions. Moving forward, the UN also kind of made a commitment saying that a deliberate and systematic attempt to terrorize, expel, or murder an entire people must be met decisively with all necessary means. So, this was what the UN and the West did when genocides took place in Bosnia and Rwanda. And even though the UN admitted to its mistakes and they talked about being committed to stopping things firmly in the future, you tell me, do you think they're doing what they promised? And do you think that it's still wise of all the other nations of the world to look towards the West to stop something that it itself has created and is aiding in the case of the Middle East? If you like this video, please share with as many people as you can. Please subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.